Next up, we have a assistant professor from Texas A&M University, Mani Rohi Rad, and we have invited him today to talk about a study that he recently published looking at land values and compared to water in the High Plains region of Colorado. Even though it's in Colorado, I read the report or the study, and I thought that it was very applicable, and especially for our members up in the Panhandle, they would get enjoyment from this presentation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rohi Rad to the stage.
Okay, howdy. So I'm an assistant professor in the agricultural economics department at Texas A&M University. This is a joint work with great co-authors. First of all, Shaheen Bahrami, he's a postdoc in my lab. He got his PhD at Texas A&M. He is in the job market now. If you're looking for water economists, let me know and I'll connect you to him. We also have Rudy Naiga, who is a professor in our department, Aaron Rosenzik, who is an assistant professor at University of Georgia, and Gabby Perez-Quesada, she's an assistant professor at University of Tennessee. And this work wouldn't have been possible without the support of USDA NIFA. Okay, so basically that was my first slide, that the talk today will focus on the state of Colorado, the High Plains portion of the state of the High Plains portion of Colorado. And this is partly because the project that we had was funded, supported us to be able to purchase data set that was necessary to conduct this analysis for the state of Colorado. And we wanted to value water within the state. And as you know, Colorado is the birthplace of the prior appropriation doctrine. It's sometimes referred to as the Colorado Doctrine. And there are similarities here between Colorado and Texas. Both of them overlie the High Plains Aquifer, and it's a major source of water supply in those regions. But there are also differences between Texas and Colorado. So if you know of funding opportunities, if you think this work is important and informative, and you think there are funding opportunities that we could pursue to conduct similar type of analysis for Texas as well, please let me know. Okay. So with that, let's get to the talk. I'm going to start with 3 sets of information, what I like to call stylized facts, and then I bring them all together. So first of all, groundwater is an important source of water supply for irrigated agriculture, particularly, as most of you here know, groundwater from the High Plains or the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the largest aquifer in the US, supports about 20% of the irrigated land in the US, and is a major source of water supply across the 7 states that overlie the aquifer. It literally supports thousands of acres of irrigated agriculture. But with that, partly due to its importance, we have seen rates of depletion since the pre-development era. You may have seen this figure generated by USGS every couple of years about the rates of depletion since the pre-development levels, that we particularly see significant depletion levels in the central and southern High Plains aquifer regions, southwest Texas and southwest Kansas and parts of Texas. So with that, one of the questions we had in mind was, groundwater is a form of natural capital. It's like a bank account that is hidden under the ground, and there is a wealth associated with that. As we deplete the aquifer, what is the loss of wealth that we extract that groundwater is associated with it? So that is one of the questions that was guiding us through this research. The second piece of information is that as we deplete aquifers, research shows that well capacities tend to decline, or well yields tend to decline with declines in aquifer levels. So aquifer levels is sometimes usually measured as saturated thickness, the thickness of the aquifer until above the bedrock. And well capacity is the maximum amount of groundwater that we can extract from an aquifer through a well and a pump. So as the aquifer levels decline, well capacities also tend to decline with it. And Well capacities, importantly, are important determinants of groundwater use. So we see two figures here. The one on the left shows the relationship between saturated thickness on the x-axis and the annual amount of groundwater use on the y-axis. And the figure on the right shows the relationship between well capacity on the x-axis and annual groundwater use on the y-axis. And so one thing we can see from these figures is the relationship between saturated thickness and annual groundwater use on the left is very noisy. There is a lot of noise around this red faded line. But when we look at the relationship between well capacity and annual groundwater use, that relationship is much more precise. Well capacity is a much better predictor of annual groundwater use than saturated thicknesses. In fact, we and others have done research on this, trying to understand the relationship between well capacity and profit maximizing levels of production. So basically, research shows that as well capacities decline, initially it may be optimal to reduce irrigation per acre, but eventually well capacity declines so far that profit maximizing decision would be to adjust irrigated acres. So again, declines in well capacity has implications for profitability and for groundwater use in agriculture as well. So with that, we also wonder, what is the value of this decline in well capacity? And the third piece of information is that as economists, when we think about value, we often think of prices and markets that allocate resources. So when we see a price of a good that we buy at the marketplace, we know that is the value of that good at the margin. But sometimes we don't have goods traded at the marketplace. For example, water or groundwater is not often traded in the marketplace. And even if it is traded at the marketplace sometimes, the characteristics associated with that water right is not always visible to us. So for example, what is the value of a foot of saturated thickness? What is the value of a gallon of well capacity? Right? These characteristics are not traded in the marketplace. So we cannot directly look at the prices to try to infer the value of those characteristics or the value of water. So we need to think about alternative ways to estimate the value of water. One way to think about it is that water is often traded with land, right? So, and land values reflect the opportunities that may result from activities in that land in the future. So, for example, if a parcel is near a growing city, then the development opportunities associated with that land will be capitalized into land values. And we will see that the land value will reflect that potential opportunity. Similarly, if you have agricultural production, a more productive land should have a higher value relative to a less productive land. Or similarly, if you have a land that is irrigated, a parcel that is irrigated, relative to a parcel that is not irrigated, we expect that this characteristic, the irrigation, to be capitalized into land values. And if you have two parcels that are similar in every other way, except that one sits on top of a part of the aquifer that has a greater saturated thickness or higher well capacity, we expect that value to be reflected, the value of water to be reflected in land values as well. As a result, we want to look at land values to try to infer, to back out the value of water in the agricultural production. So let's bring all these three facts together. So land values reflect the production possibilities that can take place in the future. Basically, land values reflect the net present value of all the production possibilities that can take place on an agricultural parcel. Well capacity is an important determinant of groundwater use and profitability for agricultural production. And as a result, we expect well capacity to be capitalized into land values. Furthermore, saturated thickness also determines how long is the life of the aquifer that is underlying this parcel of land, this specific parcel of land. As a result, we expect saturated thickness levels to be capitalized into land values as well. And there is a relationship between saturated thickness and well capacity, but it's very noisy. So you can have the two parcels with the same saturated thickness levels, but they could have very different well capacities. And as a result, saturated thickness alone may not provide us a good indication of the value of a groundwater aquifer. So that's kind of the research question that we were pursuing here. So the bigger picture question that we wanted to pursue here is, what is the value of groundwater and what is the loss of wealth as a result of aquifer depletion? If groundwater is important for production, if higher saturated thickness are associated with higher land values, as we deplete aquifers, what is the loss of wealth or loss of natural capital wealth as a result of that? And in order to answer this question, we need to answer what is the value of a foot of saturated thickness and what is the value of a gallon per minute of well capacity as we can capture them in agricultural lands. And eventually, what we are interested in is, if we ignore well capacity, do we underestimate the loss of wealth as a result of aquifer depletion? Okay, our study area is the northern High Plains part of Colorado, the part that overlaps with the Republican River Basin. This region heavily relies on the Ogallala Aquifer or High Plains Aquifer for agricultural production. And as you know, because of the Republican River Compact between Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas, and particularly the Supreme Court case in the early 2000s, this part of the High Plains Aquifer is heavily regulated in the state of Colorado. And as a result of that, there's a lot of data also collected in this region as well that helps us answer this question and study this question. And the major crops here are mostly corn and wheat and some alfalfa as well. So we collected lots of data and we put all of this data together. So first of all, from the support from this research from USDA, we were able to purchase agricultural land transactions data between 1990 and 2022. So we were able to identify all the agricultural land transactions in this part of the High Plains Aquifer in Colorado in this time period. And then, because of the pump test that the state of Colorado requires every couple of years for all the wells in this region, we were able to also collect well capacity data for all of these wells in the region. We also collected saturated thickness data from Erin Hacker's work at the University of Nebraska, and we also collected aquifer characteristics like hydraulic conductivity and specific yield and depth to water table from USGS. We also collected population and the location of cities in this region to account for the distance from agricultural parcels to the cities as well from the US Census Bureau. And finally, we also account for soil types, slope, and other parcel characteristics, and also any investment in the parcel that has taken place. So this figure basically on the right, the red dots shows the location of irrigated parcels that had a transaction in our study period. And the gray parcels that are the dots that are less visible, those are dryland parcels that with the transaction during our study period, basically between 1990 and 2022. So what we are going to do in estimating the value of water is we are going to compare these two, these red dots and gray dots. And here you can see the average prices per year for these irrigated and dryland parcels in the study area between 1990 and 2022. And you can see these are all real prices. These are all 2022 dollars. You can see overall the dryland parcels have not seen an increase in their real land values, but we have seen an increase in irrigated parcels over time. These are per acre values of agricultural land transactions for dryland and irrigated parcels. Okay. Now let's get to the results. We conducted some regression analysis, and I'll walk you through some of the analysis here, but I don't want to show you the regression to avoid presenting any math. But basically, the first column shows us the value of access to groundwater relative to a dryland parcel that doesn't have access to groundwater. The second column shows us the value of additional 100 feet of saturated thickness, and the last column shows us the value of additional 100 gallons per minute of well capacity. So let's go through the columns one by one. The first estimate here compares a parcel that is irrigated to a parcel that is very similar in every other aspect. The similar soil type, similar distance from cities, and similar investment on the buildings on that parcel, except that one is irrigated and one is not irrigated. And the stars here show that we are very confident in that estimate overall. So what does it show? It shows that a parcel that is irrigated is 110% more valuable per acre relative to a comparable parcel that is not irrigated and doesn't have access to groundwater. And in Colorado, because of the prior appropriation doctrine for groundwater and because of the moratoria that is in place for the Republican River Basin Compact, these values show up here. And part of it is due to the capital installed on land, so there's center pivot sprinkler system that is on the land. But the value is greater than that. More than what would be the value of a center pivot system. In dollar term, having access to groundwater is associated with $3,500 per acre, accounting for all the differences between. So we are comparing two similar parcels to each other, except one has access to groundwater and one is dry land. And there is no surface water irrigation in this region. The second column, as I mentioned, compares two parcels that are irrigated, except that one has a higher saturated thickness, 100-foot more saturated thickness than the other parcel. In any other way, these two parcels are very similar. They are in the same county and they're transacted in the same year, basically. What we see here is the parcel that has 100 more feet of saturated thickness is 18% more valuable per acre. In dollar terms, that amounts to $1,100 per acre more valuable for every 100 feet of extra feet of saturated thickness for the irrigated parcels. And finally, the last column compares two parcels that are both irrigated. They have the same soil type, same distance from the cities, etc., and they both have the same saturated thickness, except one has 100 gallons per minute more well capacity than the other one. And this parcel, the land value of this parcel per acre is 2% more than the other one. In dollar terms, that is about $120 more per 100 gallons per minute of well capacity, conditional on saturated thickness. So now we have these. Basically, the first column shows us the value of access to groundwater. The second column shows us only the value of having higher saturated thickness. And the last column shows us the value of more saturated thickness and also higher well capacity. So we want to look at these last two columns and study what would be the loss of wealth as a result of aquifer depletion, comparing the estimates in column 2 that don't account for well capacities and estimates in column 3 that explicitly account for well capacities. So we look at this area, and we want to study between 1990 and 2016. There has been about 20 feet of aquifer depletion in certain areas of the aquifer. We want to study what would be the wealth decline as a result of this aquifer depletion in this region. And we want to compare the estimates from the column 2 without well capacities and column 3 with well capacities. Both of them have saturated thickness. So the total irrigated acres that we have in this region is $430,000. And in order for us to account for all the irrigated acres in this region, we had to rely on assessed land values as opposed to actual transaction values. And what we find is that assessed land values are a lot lower than actual transaction land values, as you may have expected. As a result, this total land values here, total land values that we have from the assessed values is a lot lower if we had the actual transaction values. It's about $150 million here in this region. If there's time, I can show you the figure comparing these assessed values and actual transaction values. You can see how different they are. So then we want to estimate it using method 1, which is the second column, only accounting for saturated thickness. And we find that in this 30-year, the loss of wealth, keeping everything else fixed, only looking at saturated thickness level changes, results to about $6.4 million of wealth loss as a result of aquifer depletion. Whereas in the third column, where we account for both changes in saturated thickness and changes in well capacity, the total loss of wealth result that we can calculate in this approach is about $8.1 million. So overall, comparing these two approaches, we see about 20% underestimation of the loss of wealth as a result of aquifer depletion if we ignore well capacities and only look at saturated thickness as a measure of aquifer depletion. Overall, these numbers look small, and this is partly because we are looking at assessed land values. So in conclusion, we started the research thinking about land values and thinking about changes in wealth as a result of aquifer depletion. But one thing I learned from doing this research was that maybe collecting well capacities for wells is more important than I initially thought. If you collect well capacities, we can better account for land values, we can better estimate land values, and we can better calculate the changes in wealth as a result of aquifer depletion as aquifer levels decline. Saturate thickness cannot tell us a complete story of how changes in aquifer levels affect agricultural land values and the wealth under the ground. Obviously, there are some caveats here that we are only looking at changes in agricultural land values as a result of production, but there are other things that can change as a result of aquifer depletion as well that this research didn't account for. So for example, as less land is irrigated, the tax amount that can be spent on, for example, other public goods can decrease as well, and we haven't accounted for those costs of aquifer depletion. And if there are like ecosystem services provided by aquifers, that is not accounting for that. And also a major difference between Texas and Colorado here is the property rights, the groundwater rights that we have in Texas, the rule of capture compared to prior appropriation doctrine in Colorado. And I'm very curious if we do similar type of analysis in Texas, what type of values we can get, because moratoria for drilling new wells basically capitalize into those lands that actually have access to groundwater. Whereas if you can always drill a new well, then that value should be much smaller, I expect. And finally, where this type of analysis can be very helpful, I think, is that if we want to think about investing a certain amount of money across different water supply projects, the costs of those projects are important. So we want to make sure that the costs are allocated wisely. But also the benefits of those projects matter as well. So this type of analysis provides a way for us to estimate the benefits of different water supply projects as well, because the benefits are associated with the marginal value of water that is supplied through different types of projects. So I think one way to allocate funds to different water supply projects would be to consider the cost, but also consider the benefits of those projects as well. And this is where estimating the value of water could be very useful, in my opinion. If you have thoughts or questions or feedback, I would love to hear them. And this is my email. Feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Yes. We have one question.
Hi, I'm over here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm curious, the impact on land values, do you think that when the land changes hands that the purchaser is actually looking at well capacity and saturated thickness, or is it related to yield that are a function of well capacity and saturated thickness?
So that is a great question. First of all, this data is publicly available, these well capacities. I would like to hear your or the others who have purchased lands as well. I believe that if you're purchasing that land, you would do the pump test and you would estimate those well capacities as you're expecting to produce on the land for future. Saturated thickness levels are more readily available to everyone. They're published very often. But well capacities, I believe that if somebody's buying the land, would be able to do the pump test and know what is the well capacity of the well. In my experience talking to producers, they always know what their well capacities are. So I think my understanding is that they would know how many gallons per minute a well is getting.
Mm-hmm. Per foot of drawdown?
Exactly, so at the current moment. But I think you're right that those production, the yields are also important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Mani. That was kind of my question too, but to add to that question is like I wonder how much the producers are looking at things, and then also there's I guess there's the upper level of well capacity, but then a producer probably they have what they need, so as long as it's below, the maximum amount you could pull out of a well. Maybe they don't see an impact to well capacity until the saturated thickness reaches a critical thickness, and then you start seeing an impact. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
So that is a great point. I think that is what we want to do next, those threshold values. As you mentioned, I don't know if I can go to back to the slides or not. Oh, there we go. So we did look at this relationship between, this one. So we did look at the relationship between saturated thickness and well capacity, and you can see that when saturated thickness levels are high, we don't see much change in well capacity, and then after some point, as saturated thickness starts to decline, you see linear rapid declines in well capacity. But yeah, you're right that if it is above certain level of well capacity, we did some previous research, you can still irrigate the entire parcel, and you don't worry about more well capacity above that amount. But as you get closer to those threshold values, and I appreciate that point, I think we are going to explore that threshold effect on land values. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's give Dr. Rohi Rad another round of applause.